Hello, my name is Joseph Scholz. I'm the director of the Japan Intercultural Institute and author of books like Intercultural Mind and Deep Culture. And today I'm going to be introducing an approach to intercultural education developed at the Japan Intercultural Institute and with many collaborators in Europe and the US. And it's not just a concept or a set of activities. It is a completely different approach based on brain and mind sciences. It's not easy to introduce such a big topic in 15 or 20 minutes, but we'll give it a try. And hopefully this will give you an idea to see if this is something that might be interesting for you. This approach was developed because of a dissatisfaction from current approaches which rely a lot on abstract idealizations. We use big words like intercultural competence, intercultural intelligence, intercultural awareness. These words are abstract, they're idealizations, and not something you can easily introduce to those who are going to be having intercultural experiences. The approach that we developed is based on brain and mind sciences. In the past 30 years, there have been an enormous new body of research asking questions such as how are our brains shaped by culture and vice versa? How does our unconscious mind work? How does culture influence our perception and cognition? How do we embody culture and mind? How does language relate to cognition and culture? What are our biases and blind spots? And largely, this new body of research has not been included in approaches to intercultural education. And what we're trying to do is update approaches to intercultural education, which include this increased understanding of how the mind works. And we call this a cognitive process approach to intercultural education. And fundamentally, what this means is, rather than talking about culture as an abstraction or as an ideal that we want to achieve, we try to come to an empirical understanding of culture and cognition by gaining insight into how our mind works while we're having intercultural experiences. We're better able to manage both the challenges and the rewards of those foreign experiences. So this is not a feel-good approach. It's not an idealized approach. It's an approach where we say, okay, let's look at how our mind works and let's examine our intercultural experiences to come to a deeper understanding. So what does this mean in practice? Let me give you an example of how this is different from traditional approaches. Intercultural specialists and educators often struggle to agree on basic concepts such as culture. And you hear lots of debates about, for example, what is the definition of culture? Is it even possible to define culture? Is this word culture even useful for us these days? Interestingly, neuroscientists have very little problem with this, and they have a rather straightforward understanding of what culture is. And from the brain and mind science perspective, culture can be described in a single word. What is that single word? From the brain and mind perspective, culture is patterns, complex patterns of shared meaning. These are complex patterns of shared meaning, both in our body and mind, within us, in our knowledge, our cultural expectations, what we've grown up with, but also these patterns are out in the world. And therefore, when we experience a new culture, what's really happening is that the patterns within us are different from the patterns without us, and that is the experience of cultural difference. So the fundamental challenge of cultural learning is, how do we respond when the cultural patterns that we have embodied within us are different from the cultural patterns outside of us? And it's important to understand that these patterns are not just ideas or symbols or abstract concepts. They are embodied. They permeate our whole organism, and they are embedded. They're integrated in the environment, in the world around us. And culture, from the brain and mind perspective, is an emergent property. This means that culture is not a thing, it's not an object, it's not an essence. Cultural patterns are created through interaction. Whenever people interact, this creates shared experience. That shared experience creates shared understanding and shared expectations. And that shared understanding and that shared expectations create social systems at every level. Every family has its own expectations about how to do things. Every cultural community at every different level, from family to religious community to country to region. This shared experience creates shared understanding expectations. And that means that cultural patterns are dynamic. You cannot put them in a box. You cannot describe them simply with cause and effect. And cultural boundaries cannot be clearly defined. So that means that we cannot say that there is an American culture, a French culture. Cultural patterns are dynamic and complex. Let me give you another example of how the brain and mind approach can inform intercultural education. And that is in what it teaches us about cultural learning. I sometimes tell the story of a student of mine, Kentaro, who went to Canada to study English. And the first day that he arrived, he sent a text message to his friends back in Japan. Wow, everyone speaks English here in Canada. Now, he knew that people speak English in Canada before going. That's why he went. So why is it that Kentaro felt the need to tell everyone and his friends that they speak English in Canada? Well, that's because, of course, intellectual knowledge that they speak English in Canada is different from the experience of actually being in Canada and being surrounded by English and seeing English-speaking signs and hearing the sounds all around you. And that is a reminder that our foreign experiences, our intercultural experiences, are processed in two ways. They're processed by the attentive mind, which is our ability to have analytic conscious thought, and a separate set of mental processes, which are referred to as the intuitive mind, sometimes called the cognitive unconscious. And this is a complementary set of cognitive processes, which is also always functioning. The intuitive mind is something like our unconscious autopilot, and it helps us navigate everyday life. The attentive mind is conscious thinking and problem solving. And in this way, culture and the culture that we grow up in provides us the maps for our intuitive autopilot. So if I grew up in the United States, all of the routines and habits and patterns that I grew up with are input into my autopilot of everyday life. And if I arrive, say, in Japan, and I see all of these things which are unfamiliar to me, first of all, my attentive mind will need to try and figure things out, but the intuitive mind also will need to try and come to understand these new patterns. So from the brain and mind perspective, cultural learning happens as our autopilot adjusts to foreign terrain and we make sense of cultural patterns. So the brain and mind approach involves giving participants a chance to better understand their mental autopilot so that they're in better control of this learning process. From the brain and mind perspective, intercultural abilities is not an awareness or an attitude or a form of critical thinking. Interpreting intercultural situations and functioning in a foreign situation or an intercultural situation, it's an intuitive ability. It is fundamentally a pattern recognition process. And the way that we learn to recognize cultural patterns is over time through a trial and error process. And that trial and error process gives us insights, these aha moments where we have little cultural bumps, or we say, ah, now I get it. We have developed a model which defines 4 levels of cultural learning, and this is a kind of roadmap to help participants understand the cultural learning process. By understanding that process, they can better navigate their experiences. And this model is something that can be used in training and education for participants to understand the learning process. It can also be used for planning activities by trainers and educators for creating and planning activities. So what are different levels of intercultural understanding? Let's take as an example these 4 individuals. If we ask them, what do you need to do to understand a foreign culture? You will get different answers to this question. So when we asked this question to Milpo, he said, well, you need a critical understanding of differing cultural worldviews. When we asked Gilma, she said, well, you need to know the important facts and figures about that place. When we asked Juna, she said, well, you have to learn to see things from the local perspective. And when we asked Burke, he said, well, you should learn etiquette and cultural do's and don'ts. So can you rank these 4 answers? Which of these 4 answers is more simplistic, and which of these answers is more sophisticated? Can you rank them from 1 to 4? You'll often hear that perhaps the most sophisticated of these 4 is Milpo. And perhaps the simplest is Gilma, who's saying you need to know facts and figures. And often Burke is considered to be a little bit above Gilma. He's talking about cultural rules. And Juna seems to be a bit more sophisticated than that. She's talking about, getting a new perspective. So we can have a feeling for the people who have more sophisticated view of cultural learning. And this is not an accident. This is related to the way that our brain learns new complex skills. So here we can see a hierarchy of understanding. Simplistic understanding is as facts and information. A somewhat more complex understanding is rules and procedures. An even more complex understanding is a new perspective or worldview. And an even more complex understanding is a kind of meta level where you're creatively integrating and applying different perspectives. This hierarchy of understanding relates to how the brain learns. When we learn a new skill, our brain is organized in terms of networks. When we learn something new, neurons connect to each other. Those connections form networks. Those networks work together as a system. So when we learn a new skill, no matter what that skill is, we first begin with separate or individual skills. If you're learning to play tennis, you first start with individual strokes. After a while, though, you need to connect these individual skills or this individual knowledge into more complex bits. So you need to practice forehand and backhand or serving and receiving. At a certain point, however, you stop practicing individual skills and you come to this new holistic understanding. It's the moment when you stop practicing individual skills and you become a tennis player. You start to play the game of tennis. Anyone who has learned a foreign language has gone through this same progression. You start with individual words. You then start connecting words together to make sentences. And after enough time, there emerges this ability to use the language as a whole system. And you're no longer thinking about the individual rules or the individual sentences. You have the language functioning as part of a system. And that is a system level understanding. And there is, of course, an even higher level of understanding where you go beyond understanding the system and you go from being a tennis player to a tennis coach, or you go from being the speaker of a language to a teacher of a language. And this means that not only do you have this individual skill, you have connected that skill to other bodies of knowledge. This progression of simple to complex is based on dynamic skill theory by Kurt Fisher from Harvard University, an educational psychologist, and it is being applied using this model to understand levels of cultural learning. But this model can be applied to many different domains of learning, including language learning or other complex skills. So if we put this together, we can see that cultural learning also can follow this progression of simple to complex. That someone who is looking at cultural difference simply as facts and figures is having a fairly simple understanding of cultural difference. Understanding cultural difference in terms of, or cultural learning in terms of rules or cause and effect thinking is more complex. But you often hear people say, well, give me the do's and don'ts. I want to understand etiquette. That can seem a bit naive sometimes because there is a higher level of understanding. That is the ability to see culture as a holistic system and shift into different perspectives. And we can also have a meta perspective where we have abstracted principles. This one slide is a representation of this theoretical approach, this learning model. It's called the developmental model of linguoculture learning. And that is the model that we have developed at the Japan Intercultural Institute over the past many years, and which has been articulated in books that I've written. This is the central theoretical thing that I'd like to be offering today. This has been developed in with many different approaches, many different activities, both for participants in different educational and training contexts, but also in the context of train the trainers, where they learn to apply this model to their own training or education context. There are many resources to learn more about the things that I'm talking about. These are scholarly resources. I have just touched the tip of the iceberg with this, and I encourage you to dig more into the scholarly resources here. The Japan Intercultural Institute is a nonprofit institute. You can sign up for our newsletter. We have a low price membership, which lets you take part in our deep culture learning community. And we have activities like membership, like a learning circle. We also offer, we have a podcast which talks about deep culture learning. We have online masterclass. These are all resources that are available to you to learn more about this approach. I've dumped a lot of information on you. This video will be available to look at a bit more slowly. It's quite a task to explain a whole different approach to intercultural education in this short time, but I hope this has given you a taste of what I and many other educators have been working on, and I look forward to talking with you and hearing about your reactions to this, and happy to be in touch to help you learn more about this approach. Thank you so much.